How's that? See, I could hear myself the entire time, so I didn't know what was wrong with you guys. Right before we came down, we suddenly wondered, is this a good idea? We're pulling our kids out of school. It's getting to be towards the end of the school year, and there was just this little thought that maybe we should pull the plug and maybe Mark should just go down. I cannot tell you how wrong those thoughts were. The transformation on my kids, this is not the first time they've been in nature. I'm a food writer. I write passionately about agriculture. Everyone in this room knows the transformative power of places like this, and yet so strangely, we seem to need to remind ourselves about it constantly. It is a wonderful place to be. It's a wonderful community of people, and it's a really magical piece of this planet. I'm very grateful to be here. I am selling my book outside afterwards, so I'm telling you now because I will probably forget to tell you at the end. And I want this to be an interactive presentation. You're here to listen to me, but I'm also here to listen to you. So I'm going to be asking a few questions. I would ask only for correct answers. No incorrect answers, please. No, I just want you to say what you think. There are no wrong answers, and this is a learning process. So I want to start out by asking you all, what is our biggest problem? I have very cleverly given you a hint with the font. Obesity. Excellent. How did you get that? This is where obesity stood in the United States in 1960 at 13.4%. This is when NHANES, it's a big survey the CDC does, the Centers for Disease Control, started tracking BMI, body mass index, in the population. And obesity, the definition of which has not changed, was at 13.4%. Well, here's where it is now, 36%. Only this isn't quite right. This is a figure from a few years ago. They recently came out with an even more up-to-date survey, and now it's up to 39.6%. That's almost half the population. Since I've been here, everybody keeps telling me that, oh, but you Canadians are so different, you're more sensible. Well, this is where obesity stands in Canada. Not quite the same, 29%, but when you add together the cohorts of the people with obesity and overweight, it's 70% in Canada. Even in those really sensible parts of the world, like Denmark, obesity is sitting at 15%. It's on the rise, and when you look at obesity and overweight in Denmark, it's 51%. So this is how it looks over time. Something we all know. You can go and watch movies from the 60s and 70s, and it's remarkable how different people look. I watched the Eagles documentary on Netflix. I don't know if any of you haven't seen that documentary. You should. Even if you don't like the Eagles, it's an incredible documentary, but one of the most interesting things about it is just to look at the camera panning on the audience during their live shows in the early 70s, how different everybody looks. All the guys look kind of like me. They all have like a Jim Morrison body, skinny, not particularly well developed. I don't look great with my shirt off, I'll be honest. But the difference between a crowd then and now is astonishing. It's something we all take for granted to some degree, and when you go and see something like that, it's riveting how much our physical bodies have changed. We sometimes hear that obesity is the #1 leading cause of preventable death. That's in fact not true. It is still smoking. That's kind of interesting because we've been waging a war on smoking for decades now. I don't think there's a person alive who doesn't realize that smoking is deadly, and yet it is still killing more people unnecessarily than anything else. There's an interesting parallel. But when it comes to what scientists call morbidity, what they call morbidity, death is mortality, sickness is morbidity. And obesity is #1. Obesity is making people unnecessarily sick, and it's making more people unnecessarily suffer than anything, even smoking. So how do we get this way? How did this happen? What is the cause of this? This is something we've been talking about for decades. I was born in 1973, and I remember the 1980s and the war on fat. I remember when I was 11 years old, my parents took me to New York City to visit my uncle, and we went out for something called tofutti, which was a tofu-based ice cream. This was great. This is going to fix everything that's wrong with ice cream. Didn't seem to work. It used to be that we would get together at family get-togethers like Thanksgiving and argue about politics, and now we argue about food. You get into an argument with your crazy old uncle about carbs. Well, the good news is we're getting back to our old ways because we're actually starting to argue a lot more about politics as well, once again. Maybe it's politics and food that we argue about. So I'll ask you, who here thinks fat is the root cause of the obesity epidemic? Anybody? Nobody. That was once almost a universal belief. So can fat make you fat? Anyone? So let's see a hand. Okay, so it's possible. So for example, if I continue to eat, well, here's a question. If I continue to eat the diet that I'm eating, but I drank a cup of melted butter before bed every night, would that make me fat? Does anyone think that would not make me fat? Okay, we have one. So the interesting thing also to think about that is it kind of sounds disgusting, doesn't it? I mean, who would even want to do that? But maybe that's telling us something. My own reaction, our own visceral reaction to that is telling us something about how our brain actually works. What about carbs? Can carbs make you fat? Does anyone think carbs can't make you fat? Anyone in the livestock industry knows that when you want to get a pig or a cow or a chicken fat, you feed them carbs. But there's a very good reason for that, because carbs are cheaper than fat and much easier to store. What about sugar? Sugar's like white death, right? It's worse than cocaine. Is sugar worse than carbs? I mean, sugar is a carb, but it's worse. Is sugar worse than fat? What about when you mix them together? Ooh, okay. And it's delicious, right, when you do that? So if I took that hot cup of butter and mixed, 6 teaspoons of sugar into it, would that taste good? Would it taste good? No, it wouldn't. That's interesting, isn't it? So I want to tell you a story about what I think is going on. And I'm going to start. Anyone here watch the show Mad Men? Okay. Does watching Mad Men make you fat? No, just kidding. So I want to tell you about a guy named Arch West, who could have walked off the set of Mad Men. He worked on Madison Avenue in the 1950s in the advertising industry. He was a food guy. He worked on the Jell-O Puddings account. He worked on the Campbell Soup account. In 1959, he gets a call. Would you like to be the vice president of sales and marketing for the Frito Company, which is based in Dallas, Texas? Well, it's a great offer. Arch West decides to move his family to Dallas and be the VP of sales and marketing. Shortly after he gets there, the Frito Company merges with the Lay's chip company to become a company I know none of you have ever heard of called Frito-Lay. Shortly after the merger, Arch takes his kids on a trip to California. They drive from Texas to California, didn't even have a third row of seats. It's astonishing, but they somehow pulled it off. Arch stayed at a house that belonged to his friend, a guy named Lawrence Frank, and one afternoon, he ate at a restaurant owned by Lawrence Frank called the Five Crowns. It was Arch West's favorite restaurant. What he really loved was the prime rib. He loved the cream spinach. He got all the fixings. Had a great meal. He walks out the door, and this tall stranger compliments Arch and his wife on his daughter's beautiful golden hair. And they start to chat. They both work in the food industry, and the stranger says, well, have you ever eaten at my restaurant? Because this guy had a restaurant chain that was in the midst of expanding, but no, they'd never even heard of it. Turns out they were talking to Ray Kroc, McDonald's. And what is so astonishing is these two titans of the 20th century industrial food movement passed like ships in the night. What really changed the course of Arch West's life and our own lives happened a couple of days later when they decided to drive down to San Diego. And they passed what his daughter described to me as a little Mexican shack by the side of the road. And Arch West, the kind of guy, he's just got to stop and check it out. And for the first time in his life, Arch West tastes a tortilla chip, and he's blown away. And that might sound a little odd, because you think, well, how can a guy who's in charge of marketing Fritos be all that surprised by a tortilla chip? They're pretty similar. A Frito's just fried cornmeal, whereas a tortilla chip, you bake it first, then you cut it into triangles, and then you fry it. So it's a little bit crunchier. But Arch West tastes this thing, and he thinks, this is it. This is the next big hit for my company, Frito-Lay. So he goes back to Dallas. He pitches this to the corporate brass. He says, tortilla chips, guys, this is the next thing. And they just look at him funny. And they're like, what are you talking about? We sell Fritos. They're practically the same thing. I mean, people dip Fritos and bean dip and salsa. But Arch West knew better, or at least he thought he did. So he funnels discretionary funds, money that was in his budget that he was supposed to use for other stuff. He takes that, he gets an offsite facility, and he starts to develop this tortilla concept. He comes up with a name. He calls them Doritos, which in a kind of a really messed up pidgin, bastardized Spanish, means little pieces of gold. And he returns to his corporate team and he hands out samples and he says, gentlemen, I give you Doritos. And even though he did all these things he wasn't supposed to do, he lied to them. He spent money not the way he was supposed to. They gave him the green light and they said, let's do it. Let's do Doritos. And I know what you're thinking. This is the moment that everything changed. And it's not. It's not. Because this is what the first Doritos looked like. And you can see right there, it says toasted corn taste. The first Doritos were just tortilla chips, like the kind that we dip into salsa, and they bombed. They did okay in the Southwest, in Texas, places like Texas or New Mexico, where there was a Hispanic population and influence, and people knew that, yeah, tortilla chips are pretty good if you want to dip them in salsa. But everywhere else, people just didn't get it. The complaint was, the snack tastes Mexican. The snack sounds Mexican, but it doesn't taste Mexican. So once again, Arch West has to face his fellow executives. It's incredible that he even did that he didn't just outright fire the guy. He faces them and they say, what are you going to do about Doritos? And he said something very interesting. He said, let's make them taste like taco. And this elicited laughs. One of them said, our Yankee friend from the north, our fancy Madison Avenue ad guy, doesn't know the difference between a thing and a flavor. And it was a very good comment because at the time, different things had different flavors. If you wanted to experience the flavor of hot dog, you had to make a hot dog. If you wanted to experience the delicious flavor of grape or tomato, well, you had to eat grapes, you had to eat a tomato. All the things in the world all had their own flavors. How could you make a tortilla chip taste like taco? But probably because of Arch West's friendship with Lawrence Frank, who you might know because he actually brought to market something many of us have heard of called Lawry's seasoned salt. He knew that there was this new technology available, and that in fact you could make a tortilla chip taste like a taco. It didn't taste exactly like a taco. Nobody would sit there and think, I'm eating tacos. But it gave it that same savory zing. And so 2 years after these Doritos appeared. Taco-flavored Doritos. And this is what changed everything. Now, we're all nutritionists, right? We all think we know exactly what's in food. Some of us eat carbs. Some of us try and eat more protein or limit fat. But here's an interesting thing. These two Doritos, nutritionally speaking, are identical. Same amount of fat, same amount of carbs, same amount of salt. The difference is nobody wanted to eat these, and people literally could not stop eating these. And the only difference was a dusting of flavor chemicals. This was a momentous moment. Because up until this point in history, flavor had been the domain of Mother Nature. Mother Nature is who decided what tastes like what. If grapes taste delicious, if grapes are overripe and they taste too sweet and mushy. And thanks to technology, it went almost overnight from being a decision that took place in marketing. The folks in marketing were the ones who decided how food was going to taste. So I want you guys to think about food through the lens of the Dorito. The Dorito is the model. And I want to talk first about the chip itself, because even that was different. The Doritos that Frito-Lay was making in 1966 were in some ways different than those corn chips the Frito company, Fritos, were making in 1932, the year the business was started. In 1932, we were producing about 27 bushels per acre of corn. By 1967, it was up to 80. Now, it still looked like corn. Most people just didn't notice anything at all. You drive by a field of corn, it's a field of corn. But we were harvesting a lot more corn. We were getting a lot more corn off the same land. Now it's a remarkable transformation. We're up to 170 bushels. Think about that. 27 to 170. Let's look at orange yields. In 1932, 176 boxes per acre. 328 now. Strawberry, this is really 84 hundredweight per acre. Up to 720. That's almost a tenfold increase. That's almost an order of magnitude. And here's what is more than an order of magnitude. Tomatoes. We were at 2,700 weight per acre. This is in California, prime tomato growing country in the 1930s, up to 315. It's astonishing. It's not really surprising, right? You bite into a tomato now and it tastes like cardboard, wet cardboard, maybe styrofoam. It's interesting to try and find just the right metaphor to describe just how bad a tomato tastes. It's been an astonishing transformation in agriculture, and in some ways a very important one, because we have much less farmland now than we used to, because we keep on building these nice big McMansions on it, and we have more mouths to feed. And throughout the world, this is an even bigger problem. The world population is exploding. We have more and more mouths to feed, less and less farmland. It's a good thing we got this productivity, otherwise people would literally be starving. But the question we never ask, with exceptions of places like this, is did that come at any kind of a cost? For the most part, we just keep driving by those fields of corn and buying the food at the supermarket and occasionally pause to reflect on how bad the tomatoes and strawberries taste. Well, in 1999, one person did notice. Her name was Cheryl Long. She was a senior editor at Organic Gardening, and she had read a study in the British Nutrition Journal that had looked at the nutrition of whole foods, modern versions versus old versions, and found the modern versions didn't seem to be quite as wholesome. They didn't have as much of the micronutrients, not as much minerals, not as much vitamins. And Cheryl Long was quite alarmed by this. She thought this was a bad thing, potentially a very bad thing. So she sent a letter to the USDA, said, what's going on with our food? Do you know what the USDA did with her letter? Can anyone guess? This one is an easy one. They lost it. So she sent it again. They lost it 3 times until she finally managed to get someone's attention. And then they responded back and said, there's nothing to worry about here. It could be that maybe there's just a bit more water in our produce today, which I'm not sure that's a good thing. But maybe, we just don't really measure stuff all that well. But really, nothing to see here. Don't be alarmed. Well, it did catch one guy's attention. His name is Don Davis, a biochemist at the University of Texas who worked in a lab that had discovered more vitamins than any other lab in the world. And Don Davis thought, this doesn't sound great. He read the study in the British Nutrition Journal, and he thought there was a couple things wrong with it. He thought, maybe they got a few things wrong. So he set out to do his own study. And he took every possible measure to make sure there was not the slightest bias towards heirloom fruits and vegetables. He tested them, and he found that there was indeed a difference. He published this study, looked at 43 garden crops, and the nutrition was not the same. This is what it looked like. Calcium was down by 16%, iron down by 15%, vitamin C down by 15%, riboflavin down by 38%. We talk about whole foods being wholesome, and yet they're less wholesome than they used to be. Don Davis called it the dilution effect, and he sought to find out why was this happening. Well, it wasn't new. Since the 1940s, he'd found out that people were aware of the dilution effect. It's because of these hyper-productive agricultural techniques. When we grow our crops in soil that's fortified with NPK, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, you can get a lot of food. You can get a remarkable amount of food. But it's not quite the same because that soil isn't the same. The minerals aren't the same. The microorganisms aren't the same. But it's also genetics, because we have been breeding our fruits and vegetables for what we call agronomic traits: longer shelf life, better disease resistance, and the number one trait of all, yield. So it has been the triumph of quantity, but we've paid for it in quality. And as we all know, you bite into one of these tomatoes and it tastes like styrofoam. But there's a problem with what I just told you, because it doesn't quite match up, because nutrients don't have any flavor. All these things we just talked about, calcium, iron, potassium, vitamin C, riboflavin, only one of them has a taste, and that's vitamin C, and vitamin C tastes a bit sour. So all you can really say is that produce got 15% less sour over the last 50 years, which doesn't sound that bad. But we know there is a connection between this dilution of nutrition and this dilution of flavor, and we know it because of this guy, a guy named Harry Klee. In 1987, Harry Klee was working for a company that I know all of you love almost as much as you love Frito-Lay, and that company was Monsanto. Harry had just graduated from university, and they asked him to create a better tomato. Because as much as the industry will tell you there's nothing wrong with tomatoes, they all know that there is something wrong with tomatoes, and the reason is because of Granny Smith apples. Those actually are tomatoes. That's what tomatoes look like when they pick them in places like Florida and in California. They pick them green and as hard as a baseball. And they take them to places like this, where they sit sometimes for weeks. And then they decide, let's move these to market. let's put them on a supermarket shelf, but they know they can't put something that looks like a Granny Smith apple on the shelf, so they fog them with ethylene gas, which is a plant hormone, and this initiates the ripening process. The tomato turns red, and people buy it. They think this looks great, and they put it in their sandwich, and they have to dump all sorts of salt and Miracle Whip on it because it tastes like styrofoam. So they thought, the problem is just that we're picking them too early. So if we could figure out how to get a tomato to ripen more slowly, well, instead of ripening in a week, if we can stretch that to 3 weeks, we can let the tomato ripen for 2 weeks, stick it in our factory storage warehouse, and then take it to market. So they asked Harry Klee, do you think you can help us create a genetically modified tomato that will ripen slowly? So he said, sure, why not? Let's give it a try. So Harry Klee inserted a gene found in a soil bacteria into a tomato, and the hope was that this would just slow things down. Well, he planted this crop in 1993 in Bonita Springs, Florida, and around Christmas time he went out into the fields, and the plants were just they looked like tropical Christmas trees, all hung with these red balls of fruit that looked perfect. So they picked a bunch of them, they brought them here, they stuck them in a box. 2 weeks later, Harry Klee comes back, he pulls out a Swiss Army knife, he pulls a tomato out of a box that looks so perfect it could almost be a toy. And he slices a little disc off, and he pops it in his mouth, and he is underwhelmed. Doesn't taste any better. At that point, Harry Klee quit Monsanto and took a job at the University of Florida and devoted the rest of his life to discovering what the heck happened to tomatoes. He has grown over 500 varieties of heirloom tomatoes. Anyone here grow heirloom tomatoes? Well, he discovered something some of you may have discovered, is that a lot of heirloom tomatoes actually suck. Most of them don't taste very good, but there's a subset that taste absolutely incredible. And Harry Klee started to compare what is different about these tomatoes that taste delicious versus the tomatoes that everybody's buying. I don't know how well you can see this, but this is a chart that appeared in the journal Science, one of arguably the best scientific journal in the world. And you can see those two bars just a bit to the right of center there called concentration. One of them is called Cerasiform, the other one's called Floridade. So Cerasiform is a very old tomato variety, and Floridade is a very new one. And over here on the left, you can see these are all flavor compounds, and it keeps going down. In the old variety, 16.28 down to 5.25. You've got 0.21 down to 0.03, 0.75 down to 0.25, 0.67 down to 0.18. Now, part of this, once again, is how we grow tomatoes. We just bomb them with fertilizer, try to crank out the maximum number of tomatoes. But it also had to do with genetics. Modern tomatoes literally don't know how to be flavorful anymore because we kept selecting them for the agronomic traits. We wanted shelf life. We wanted a thicker skin. We wanted yield. And every time you make those selections, it's like evolution. When you select one trait and you don't select another, you put reverse pressure on that trait. You lose that trait. Tomatoes lost flavor for the same reason we don't have tails anymore, because if you don't keep selecting a trait, it goes away. Tomatoes have forgotten how to be flavorful. You can get modern tomato seeds and grow them in the most richest soil, with the most minerals, the most organic life. You can sing them lullabies. They will not be flavorful. They do not have the ability. So that is what we have done to food, not just our corn, but everything. We have more of it, and it literally doesn't taste the way it's supposed to taste. We ask, why don't people eat more whole foods? Well, not only are those whole foods less wholesome, they don't taste any good. This is a gas chromatograph. This is the machine that Harry Klee uses to figure out what flavor compounds are in his tomatoes. And this is really the linchpin in this whole story. The first gas chromatograph went on sale in the mid-1950s. And this was a big moment. Before then, scientists could only really scratch their head when it came to flavor in food. They knew an amazing amount back then about actual nutrients. If you go and look at some of the thicker cookbooks of the era where the writers would write about nutrition, they knew about protein, we knew all the vitamins at this point. We even knew about omega-3s and omega-6s. Our nutritional knowledge was close to complete in terms of what's actually in food. But boy, when it came to flavor, no one had any idea. That's because when I showed you this thing, The amount of flavor is so tiny. Flavor is measured in parts per million, sometimes parts per billion, even parts per trillion. We didn't have anything that was sensitive enough to measure it. Well, then along comes the gas chromatograph. And it's pretty simple, actually. It just has this little plate that heats stuff up, turns it into a gas. The gas goes into a big tube. And in the big tube, all the compounds separate. So out the other end march all your flavor compounds, and you can measure them. And they would actually have people sitting there sniffing them as they came off the line, and they would capture them, and they would use something called mass spectroscopy to figure out what it was. They could capture flavor in a bottle, they could analyze it, and for the first time in human history, we knew what made coffee taste like coffee, we knew what made oranges taste like oranges, and we knew what made tacos taste like tacos. Well, it didn't take long before these eggheads in the science department figured out what flavors were, that people in industry said, flavor, eh? And we started making flavors in places like this, flavor factories. Anyone here live in New Jersey? IFF, Symrise, Firmenich, Givaudan. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. There are flavor factories on every continent except Antarctica. And that's what we put in our food. That's what appeared in these original taco-flavored Doritos, right there in the ingredient bar. Flavorings. That sounds innocuous. Flavorings. How bad could flavorings be? Flavorings. Gets to a question we never actually ask. We talk about protein. We talk about soy protein versus whey protein. We talk about fructose versus sucrose, high fructose corn syrup versus sucrose. But we never ask this really basic question, which is, why does food even have flavor? Like, what's it doing there? We all tend to think it's bad, like, oh my God, it's too delicious, I ate too much, get it away from me. But what is it doing there? If you look at your genome, if you imagine your genome as the instruction manual to make you, what is the thickest chapter? It's like chapter on your brain, probably, right? Or maybe your eyes. Like the eye is so complex, it's got a lens, it's got an iris. Maybe your gonads, right? Reproduction. Evolution wouldn't happen without reproduction. The thickest chapter by far is the chapter on making your flavor sensing equipment, your nose and your mouth. We think that we taste just with our mouths, but the nose is the real workhorse. When we eat, these wafts of gassy flavor go down the back of our throat and up that little hole in the, connects to your nose. It's called retronasal olfaction. That's why when you have a cold, you can't taste anything. And the genes it takes to create that sensing equipment requires more instructions than any other part of your body. So it must have done something really important for evolution to have chosen this, to basically said, this stuff is really, really, really important. So why does food have flavor? Why is this cow eating a dead rabbit? Weird, eh? I don't know. I was hoping you guys might know. I can't figure it out. Maybe it's just a weird cow. Why is this deer eating a dead rabbit? The reason they're eating dead rabbits is because they're deficient in phosphorus. And when ruminants become deficient in phosphorus, they start eating bones. It's kind of weird. What are they doing? It's kind of funny because there's phosphorus in bones, and if you're phosphorus deficient, eating bones is actually a really good way to get phosphorus. But what health magazine did they read that told them this? If you're feeling fatigued and you have brain fog, eat a dead rabbit. No one ever told them that. How do they know? A guy named Fred Provenza, guy who changed my life, changed my way of thinking, a very dear friend. Some of you may know him or know of him. He wrote a book recently called Nourishment. He would do studies. He would make sheep deficient in phosphorus. Really weird studies. He'd put a tube down their throat. And one day, he'd give them some maple-flavored feed, and he'd put in this little blast of phosphorus in their rumen, in their sheep tummies. And then the next day, he'd give them coconut-flavored feed. And then he'd put water in their stomachs. So they never actually tasted the water. They never tasted the phosphorus. All they got was this sensation of maple or coconut. And maple was always paired to phosphorus. And then a few weeks later, he'd make them deficient in phosphorus again. He wouldn't put anything in their stomach. He'd just give them a choice. Do you want maple-flavored feed or do you want coconut-flavored feed? And they would go for the maple. Because their brains figured out, this is what I need. Now, you might think, well, I mean, maple's delicious. Maybe sheep just love maple. Well, over in another pen, he reversed it. He paired up the phosphorus to the coconut. And those sheep, when he made them deficient in phosphorus, they went for the coconut. That's why we have this thing called a nose and this thing called a mouth. Because our brain is constantly vacuuming up information about the food that we eat and the nutrients that wind up in here and all over here, and that's how it figures out what am I supposed to eat. Well, might be true for deer, might be true for cows, but is it true for humans? Most scientists will say no. But when British sailors were sailing the world and would get sick with scurvy, these are not British sailors, they don't have scurvy, but it evokes the spirit. The first sign of scurvy, we all heard about scurvy, right? Your hair falls out, your gums swell. The first sign of scurvy back then, when you read the ship's logs, was what they called scorbutic nostalgia. It was a craving for the vegetable productions of nature. The men would be so sick, they would be sitting on deck, unable to move, and they would cry at the thought of oranges or vegetables. There's a great story about a British expedition that kind of gets blown around the South Pacific. They're adrift. The people are dying of scurvy. They're throwing 20 bodies overboard a day. They finally limp into Juan Fernandez Island, which is just this chunk of green in the middle of the South Pacific, and they scramble on shore. And they wrote about pulling Sicilian turnips out of the ground and eating a moss that tasted like garlic, and they wrote about how delicious it was, and they all got better. So they were obviously reading the same health magazine as the deer and the cow. How did they know? Where does that come from? Well, we have better evidence, thanks once again to this guy, Harry Klee. Because let's look at this chart again. Harry Klee went to give a talk at a company many years ago just about how tomatoes make flavor. Because he thought, if I can figure out how a tomato makes flavor, and I can figure out what genes are making the flavor, I can start to test for those genes, I can start to select, I can start to get flavor back in tomatoes. So he gave this talk, and he was talking about just one flavor compound, and he described the metabolic pathway. He says, we wind up with this flavor, cis-3-hexanol, let's say, and he followed the metabolic chain of events. He looked at all the little enzymes that created that flavor, and he found it actually started with something called alpha-linolenic acid, which is an omega-3 fatty acid. Well, there's a guy in the audience named Steve Goff who thought, boy, that's really interesting, because one of the flavors that Harry talked about was an amino acid, a really big and a metabolically expensive amino acid, an essential amino acid that you need just to continue living. If you didn't get it, you'd die. And he thought, that's interesting, because as a physiologist, he looked at this and he thought, it's a pretty impressive amino acid. Maybe there's some connection going on. So Harry and Steve Goff got together, and at this point, Harry had found that there's about 26 flavor compounds that drive our love of tomatoes. 26. There's like 350 in the tomato. We can sense most of them, but the brain's just like, no, don't care. I just want these 26. And every single one of those flavor compounds they found was synthesized from an essential nutrient. So we can't taste the essential nutrients. We can't taste the omega-3s. We can't taste the amino acids. We can't taste the carotenoids, which our body turns into vitamin A. But what we can taste is what the tomato turns that stuff into. So the flavor of a tomato is like a big chemical sign telling your brain, there's good stuff inside me. That's why we love tomatoes, because when we taste those flavors, our brain knows this is good. You should eat this. So think about what we did with the gas chromatograph. We took the flavor of a tomato that for millions of years had been inextricably linked to the essential nutrients in a tomato. They were chemically bonded. You couldn't have one without having the other, and then we created this. Ketchup-flavored potato chips. It has the zing of a tomato. It tells your brain, there's good stuff in here, you should eat me. But you do not get those nutrients. What do? You get a big hit of grease, carbs, and salt. And it's right there on the ingredient panel. Flavor. Let's think about soft drinks for a second, because we always talk about soft drinks are sugary drinks. It's the sugar that's reinforcing in soft drinks. Now, I think it's the sugar that's nutritionally bad in soft drinks. I mean, that's what makes people fat. That's what gives people diabetes. But would anybody drink this stuff if not for the flavorings? If we took all the flavorings out of soft drinks, they would all just be sugary soda water. I've made sugary soda water. I've fed it to my kids. They don't like it. It doesn't taste like anything. It's the flavoring that gives it that magic, that makes us take a sip and go, I want to take another sip. And it's there, again, on the ingredient panel. Artificial flavor. Well, that scares people. Artificial flavor. Does anyone know the difference between an artificial flavor and a natural flavor?
Yes.
What's the difference?
A natural flavoring is a proprietary blend that they won't tell you what's in it.
A proprietary blend, they won't tell you, but that's also true about an artificial flavor. They will not tell you what's in an artificial flavor. Any other guesses?
Derived from some natural substance.
Derived from a natural substance. That is a very good answer. So what a natural flavor is, let's go back to the tomato. There's 26 flavor compounds. Well, if you wanted to make an artificial tomato flavor, you'd get a hydrocarbon, something like coal oil, and you'd give it to a company like DuPont, and they would get a chemical engineer to make all 26 compounds that you want. You'd put it in a little jar, and you'd be like, bingo, we got our tomato flavor. You put that on your potato chips, they taste delicious. But then everybody got afraid, oh, artificial, it sounds scary. So what they said is, well, hold on a second. All these flavorings are found in other parts of nature. So we can get one of them from grass clippings. They're cheap. We can get another one from birch bark. We can get another one. We can genetically modify a yeast to make a flavoring. Natural flavorings, a lot of them come from genetically modified yeast. That's how natural they are. There's really no difference. We put them in everything. There's flavorings in butter. Because a lot of us know that cultured butter tastes better than just regular whipped butter. It might be better for you because there's like cultures in cultured butter, good for the microbiome. But then some companies are like, that's just a pain in the butt. Why don't we just put a flavoring in there that makes it taste like cultured butter? They'll never know the difference. Pork is now so bland that we have to add flavor to pork. Go to the supermarket. Don't do this at your farmer's market. You won't find it. But go to the supermarket. Look at the ingredient panel on a pork shoulder. You find flavoring in pork, in raw pork. There's flavoring in craisins. Not all, but the pomegranate infused ones, the pomegranate juice infused. It's not just pomegranate juice. They sell you marinated salmon with grill flavor so that you don't have to grill it. You can just put the grilled flavor on. Here's an interesting one. This is supposedly a health food, yogurt, filled with flavorings. You know those little tubes of yogurt you get? Does anybody have children? Your children are whining and you had a hard day at work, so you just give them a yogurt tube and you pat yourself in the back as you give them a healthy snack. There's no fruit. It is milk, cream, sugar, and flavor. Yogurt, oddly, is like Doritos now. Just a bland, caloric substrate, and then we salt in the flavors and we think it's yummy. There's flavoring in raw chicken. Chicken is the blandest, most productive meat, but we got to flavor it. Basically, everything has turned into a Dorito. So much of the food we eat is a highly caloric vehicle on which we impose flavor. It is not up to Mother Nature anymore. It's all up to the folks in marketing. So it sounds pretty depressing. It sounds as though technology, it's like the fruit of knowledge. It just took us to a bad place. The more technology we apply to food, the worse it seems to get. But I'm actually not an enemy of technology. I think it's a tool. Like nuclear technology is a tool. You can use it as a way to kill lots and lots of people, destroy cities, or you can use it as a means of diagnosing whether somebody might have cancer. And I think the same is true with all the technology we've been talking about. And I want to tell you about something that Harry Klee made, which is what I would call the perfect tomato. He had long had this idea that he's going to elucidate the genetics of tomato flavor and use those markers to breed better tomatoes. But one day he thought, well, there might be an easier way to do this. He took his most flavorful heirloom, the heirloom that always scored the highest, which is called a Maglia rosa. And he crossed that with one of those Florida tomatoes. And he thought, he just wanted to get kind of a compromise, because as awesome as heirloom tomatoes are, they're also, they're really finicky to grow. There are certain positive aspects to modern tomatoes. The thick skin really isn't a bad thing. Because we've all had that experience. You go to the farmer's market, you buy a brandy wine, and you have it that night. It's incredible. And then the next morning, the other brandy wine that you bought has cracked. It's mushy. There were a few good things about commercial tomatoes. And he thought, well, if I just cross them, I'll get like a compromise. It'll taste pretty good. It'll have pretty good yield. It'll have pretty good shelf life. He got this incredible tomato that had great shelf life, great productivity, great disease resistance, and its flavor was indistinguishable from the heirloom parent. One of the most productive tomatoes he's ever grown. He's gotten 20 pounds of fruit off a single plant. It's called a garden gem. He also grew the garden treasure, created the garden treasure. Anyone ever grown a German queen tomato? It's similar to a brandy wine, a meaty, delicious, great in a sandwich. He crossed that with one of these modern tomatoes, and he got another terrific tomato. So we can get back what we took out. The reason we often think, this is probably the most exciting news in this journey, is that we tend to think that quantity and quality are a zero-sum game. You can have quality, but you can't have quantity, or you can have quantity, but you can't have quality. But remember when I told you about flavor, how hard it is to detect? It's parts per million, parts per billion. You really don't need much of it. It's metabolically inexpensive for a plant to produce flavor. We just need to get plants that know how to make flavor. Which means it is possible that you could go into a supermarket, and then if that supermarket sourced their tomatoes from growers that cared about flavor and cared about how to grow tomatoes, you could go to a supermarket and buy a good tomato. Which sounds like a fantasy, but it could be true. It isn't true yet, but I think one day it will be. I hope one day it's true. This is something called Rutgers Scarlet Lettuce. This was developed by a guy at Rutgers named Ilya Raskin. And his goal here was, well, he wanted to improve the health of Americans. And he thought, he wanted to take something that was nutritionally benign. So lettuce is a good example. We eat a lot of lettuce. Lettuce is not really nutrient dense. It's kind of empty. I don't think it's a bad food, but it's not a superfood by any stretch. And he thought, what if I can make lettuce have more nutrition? Then people can just go about their business eating lettuce, and it'll be better for them. So he was targeting a family of chemicals called polyphenols. You guys might have heard of them. They're a secondary compound. It's not a nutrient. It's a compound produced by plants that are believed to have all sorts of health effects. For example, for diabetes, insulin sensitivity. Blueberries are really high in polyphenols. And he thought, well, what if I can make a lettuce high in polyphenols? So what he did is he went to a supermarket, buys a head of red lettuce, sticks it in the blender, puts that goop underneath his microscope, and he starts to pick out the reddest cells he can find. He grows a whole new head of lettuce from them, sticks it in the blender, looks for the reddest cells. He did this 5 times. He got a lettuce that is more dense in polyphenols even than blueberries in 5 generations. But here's what's interesting. He also got flavor. This lettuce, which is being marketed now, limited as Nutrileaf, tastes more like lettuce. Doesn't taste like blueberries. It has, I guess, what I would call structure. If you put this in a salad, the lettuce has a presence. It's more satisfying. You feel better after you eat it. So, as alarming as it is what we've done to food in the name of quantity, in the name of getting more people to eat it, it's really not surprising when you think that corporations are really out there to make money. We can use that same knowledge to fix what went wrong. So I would say this to you, as much as we all think that we're nutritionists, that we all know what we need, your brain's the one that really knows. And this system served us so well for millions of years. We wouldn't be here if we didn't have an intuitive ability to eat. But we've just led ourselves astray by lying to ourselves, by creating food that tells nutritional lies, that gets us excited in the moment and leaves us bankrupt. We all know how that feels. You can't control yourself from eating in the moment, and you're left with nothing but regret. But if you eat real food, and even more importantly, if you seek to eat the most delicious real food, you will never eat better in every possible way. So I would like everybody to think about flavor. Food ultimately is about what's in the nutrients, what gets into our bodies, but eating is an experience. We crave deliciousness. We can't live without it. We just need to do deliciousness the right way. Thank you very much. And by the way, if any of you actually want to grow those tomatoes, you can get the seeds for a $10 donation to fund more research at the University of Florida. You'll get a package of seeds in the mail. So this is the website, write it down. You can get some seeds. Tell Harry I sent you. He might send you extra seeds. Question. So what's in natural flavorings and is it healthy? So when something has natural flavorings, and you'll find this everywhere, you'll find it in your children's granola bars, you find it in yogurt, it means that they found these chemicals from a natural source and used a quote natural process. So things like distillation or putting something in a centrifuge or heating it. I wouldn't say any of these chemicals are unhealthy on their own. There's always this worry, I'll eat an artificial flavor, it's going to give me brain cancer. That's always the most direct thing. Does this give me brain cancer? I think the big problem is how much we eat. And these chemicals will make you eat more. It's the same as with Doritos. It made us eat food that we did not want to eat. That ordinarily the brain would say, I don't want that. And you put these chemicals on and it triggers something and we start to eat. So the toxicity for me is calorie toxicity. It's a lifetime of eating these foods that leaves us overweight, gives us hypertension, diabetes, higher risk for Alzheimer's. That's where the toxicity is.
So both natural and artificial flavorings can be full of excitotoxins. Like I think you're talking a lot about excitotoxins in food, right?
I don't think of them as acutely toxic on their own. You can make an apple-flavored drink that has the same flavor compounds that are in an apple. The flavor compounds in the drink aren't toxic. They will make you drink sugar water that you wouldn't ordinarily drink, thinking, hey, this has, your brain's like, there's apple in here, there's vitamin C, there's all this good stuff. It's the behavior that it causes. When we, like I said, the biggest problem is obesity. We're improving a lot of health parameters, but obesity is predictive of so many of our diseases that are getting worse, that are headed in the wrong direction. It literally makes food taste delicious that should not taste delicious.
You mentioned this knowledge is there, you have the knowledge, and you're not opposed to science related to that knowledge, which I agree with. However, it seems to be that corporate America has led us to harness what used to be this science and knowledge base in a particular way for maximizing profit. Do you feel there's a fundamental conflict between corporate marketing departments and this knowledge base that's clearly there for all of us to harness? Is there a conflict between the corporate profit motive and deploying that knowledge?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there is. So the question is there a conflict between the motive for profit in corporate America and what we know to be both wrong and right with food? And I think the answer is yes, there is a conflict. Something that most people don't know is that there's flavorings in cigarettes. If you go to the right websites, you can actually see advertisements for flavorists. The people who might work for Frito-Lay could go get a job with Philip Morris creating. I uncovered documents from the 70s showing that kids, teenagers, like flavored cigarettes more. So they're doing it all the time. There are unscrupulous humans. They don't think they're unscrupulous. I was at a flavor company, and they were showing me how they make fake cinnamon flavor. And they pointed to these chemicals, and they say, these are the chemicals that make food delicious. And I said, do you think there is a problem with chemicals like these and the obesity epidemic? And they said, well, eating is a personal choice. And I thought, it's not really true. I mean, we don't really, as you sit there and eat a meal, you don't make a conscious, rational decision like, I'm going to have another bite. I'm going to have another bite. It doesn't work like that. It is unconscious. It is a reaction to the chemical stimulants that are in our food. It was designed that way for a reason, because real food has good stuff in it. So there is. The question is, how do you fix this? And I mean, I would love to ban flavorings. If we banned flavorings, there would be no processed food. People aren't going to go around eating Twinkies and Doritos and soft drinks that have no flavorings. I don't see that happening. I think the interests are just too large. But I do think consumers have muscles that they can flex. We've already seen this. If you look at something like the craft beer movement, if you got on a time machine and went back to 1987 and got a bunch of beer executives in a room and brought out a crystal ball and said, I envision a future where 35% of the beer that people buy will be hoppy, will be made by small brewers and have way more flavor than Miller Lite and Bud Light, they would say there's no way that's happening. They used to talk, they would laugh at how stupid consumers were because beer aficionados could not tell the difference between Miller Lite and Bud Light and Coors Light. that world is turning over. All of the growth in beer is in craft beer. The profit margins are way better. And this has been driven not by some knowledge that there's a particular compound in craft beer that makes us healthy. It's because we just want beer that actually tastes like something. If you look at wine, Americans really didn't drink much wine. Of course, there's alcohol in wine. There's concern about alcohol. But wine tends to be associated, when they look, for example, at the shopping carts of wine drinkers versus beer drinkers, wine drinkers make healthier choices. We're drinking much more wine. We don't really have this problem with spending more money on wine. I don't know anybody who buys the absolute cheapest wine. I don't even know what that wine is. But we all buy the absolute cheapest chicken, the absolute cheapest tomatoes. So I think we can turn this ship around, but it's really hard. It starts at places like this with people who say, I want to eat differently. And they go to farmers markets, and then eventually the supermarkets think, well, I would love to capture a piece of that. And that bothers us when the supermarkets try to get in on it. But I think it's a good thing, because if we can flex our muscle, and if we can create a profit motive for people to actually do it the right way, we can make it better. So it's not easy. It's like turning around an aircraft carrier, but I think it can be done. Yeah, wow, that's a great question. How do you deal with teenagers? I think you just lock them in a room for about 7 years and feed them through like a little hole, like a little hatch. No, I think the most important thing is to expose them to good food. A lot of people tell me, oh, the food you're talking about is snobby. How are we supposed to feed poor people? It's a great question. Healthcare is another good question. Healthcare is expensive. Well, we all feel that everyone has a right to healthcare. Doesn't everyone have a right to good food? But here's another thing. I think the snobbery, on some level, it really bugs me. And I get annoyed by people who think they're better because they ate a more expensive meal than me. Perhaps because I'm jealous. But it's actually important, because we have to layer on some social value to these foods. If you go to places like France and Italy, well, they have this wonderful tradition, hundreds of years old, about great wines and great cheeses. Well, they're not cheap. But they're not all hung up about snobbery. It's something people aspire to. If you make a little bit of money, one thing you can do is enjoy a really good meal. So nobody ever says, well, the new iPhone, that's not fair. That's snobby. Not everybody can afford the new iPhone. It's amazing how many people find a way to afford the new iPhone and yet buy crap. So I understand that there's this snobbery situation, that not everybody can afford it. But the truth is we have to value these foods. That if there's a social value in saying, I bought asparagus at the farmer's market. It was picked that morning. It was unbelievable. Well, there's a snobby thing there, but something, asparagus really is unbelievable. And we should celebrate that. Okay.
So first, thank you for your work, and for those disconnected.
Yeah, great question. So the worry is that as we get better at understanding how plants produce flavor, that we can game that and create something like a Dorito tomato that tastes like a tomato but doesn't have any of the good stuff. On some level, that's at this point not possible, and it's hard to imagine how it could be, because ultimately this is a living thing, and tomatoes have to live. So even these nutritionally dumbed down tomatoes, nutritionally are still way, 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 way better than Doritos, like way better. If we all ate these nutritionally dumbed down foods, we still would be getting, it'd be pretty good. But Harry Klee will tell you that often the best way to get the flavor that you want in the tomato is just to increase the substrate, to increase the nutrient itself. I think if we create a market and an incentive, farmers will care. I'll give you a good example, is the wine industry. The wine industry uses exclusively heirloom varieties. There hasn't been plant breeding in the world of wine for hundreds of years. And they employ methods, I'm not going to say they're all perfect, but they're not into hammering their vineyards with NP and K because they know the wine sucks. That's an industry that has recognized that they will take a little less quantity in the name of quality. So I think any industry could be like that. The same way Mercedes knows that it's more expensive to make a Mercedes than a Kia, but people seem to be willing to pay for it. So I think we can create a farming paradigm where we don't have these trade-offs, but we just need to incentivize it. We need to spend a little more money on food. Thank you. So I would love to talk to some of you after. There still seems to be a few. Oh, Dave? Thank you. Thank you.